Hey everybody, MS Farzan here, and welcome to this video tutorial on how to deploy a full stack app to Heroku. In this tutorial, we're going to take an app that we've created in a development environment and move it to a production environment and configure everything so that it runs smoothly on Heroku. Now, if you're wondering where this app came from, you can watch or work through the video or written tutorial that will link in the description section of this video. That's called How to Create a Full Stack Character Generator Using MEVN or the Mongo Express Vue and Node.js stack. It's not really that important that we're using MEVN or Heroku here. Of course, your app might be different. You might be using a different framework for your front or back end, or you might be deploying to another web service like Docker or Amazon EC2 or something like that. And of course, those are going to be very different in terms of their exact implementation. But I think what's important to glean from this video is the configuration that's needed and the thought process that goes into deploying a full stack app after you've created it and made it work locally in a development environment on your machine. So some of the specifics might not be specific to your needs, and I'd encourage you to take a look at the previous tutorial about how we created this app, although I will walk you through the code in what we've done here so far so that you can take a look at the front and back ends of this app and understand what we've done here and where we're going with it. Additionally, it's important to note that there's a lot of configuration that's required to move an app from development to production. So it would be a good idea to take a look at the documentation of your particular stack and get a good understanding of some of the things that you might need to change in addition to what we're going to do here in this video. So the backend of our app is a simple server that runs on Express, and it serves as an API that interfaces with a database that is supported by Mongo. This works actually pretty well on my machine, and the impetus for the app is to create a database that allows us to store characters for a role-playing game if we wanted to run a simple character generator for a role-playing game like one of my games, which is called Entromancy. The front end of it is built on Vue, and it's a simple single page application where if we go into the source, we see that there's an entry point in main.js which mounts a Vue component called app. And in the app itself imports two Vue components that make GET requests at the localhost port 3000 and make requests of the server API so that it can retrieve or write characters from and to the database. It's pretty simple and pretty straightforward. If you're working on anything single page application wise, you'll find it to be pretty bare bones in that respect. The way that I run it on my machine is I'll open a few command lines so you can see this all working together. And I'll also link this code on GitHub, the development level code. First, I will stay in this directory, and I will just say MongoD to start my database. And then I'll move into the server directory and run npm run start, which is the that starts the script and connects us to the database. And then I will we'll go to the navigate to the client directory and run npm run serve. You can do all this if you like by cloning the repository on GitHub. And now that I have the server client and the database running, I can open a new tab in my web browser and move to localhost 8080, and I see I have this very simple single page app where I have a character viewer, and it's displaying each of the characters in my database and what class they are. if I wanted to create a character, I could go to this Create a Character tab and enter a name. Let's say the person's name is just Iskander. I get to choose if they're a mage, warrior, or thief. Let's say they're a thief. I click on Create Character, and that sends a post request to my API to create a new character in my database. And when I move over to View All Characters, I see that it's appended the new character to my list of characters and what class they are. In the front end, in the client, that's displayed here when we say that we want to make a GET request to the characters endpoint at the localhost 3000 port. And in the actual character viewer section of it, we see that the way that View displays this, it's not really important right now, is that we run a for loop to show all of the characters in our database, all the items that are in our database from our GET requests, and also their profession or their class. In the character creator section, the important thing to note here is that we have some HTML and a little bit of styling, but the important part is this method where we use Axios, which is a package that we've imported to make post requests to our database. You know, not really all that fancy, just pretty simple, straightforward. We're going to use Heroku as a web service to deploy our app to the web. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, you could use a host of other services. Popular ones are Docker and Amazon. If you're working on with some sort of Microsoft software, if you're let's say coding in Blazor or doing something in .NET, you'll probably use Azure. I find Heroku to be the simplest entry point for deploying full stack apps to the web. If you have just static files, you could probably just deploy them to Git pages or do something a little bit easier. Heroku is just it has the gentlest learning curve that I've seen in terms of deploying web apps, with probably Azure being a close second. I find Docker to be a little bit more work, and Amazon EC2 certainly requiring more configuration. So Heroku is just a great place to learn how to do things. And once you learn how to deploy to Heroku, you'll have a good foundation of learning how to deploy to other web services. I'm not really sure about the pricing, and if that's an issue for you, that might be something to consider. And the first thing that you'll want to consider when you're moving from your development environment, as we have here, and with the code that we have, is think, well, as you can see, the way that I've split this up here, I have a client and I have a server directory. And these are compartmentalized in a way that if I wanted to, I could deploy the server to Heroku and deploy the client somewhere else and just have the client make API requests from elsewhere. Conversely, I could have them both running on the same service, which is what we're going to do in this video. And for our use case scenario, it doesn't really matter the way that we do it. I think it's a little bit neater and cleaner to have everything in one place. But if we had a bigger app with a lot more functionality and certainly a lot more users, it might just make more sense for us to host our client files elsewhere and just make the API requests to the server on Heroku, or even have two Heroku apps. So that is really something you'll need to think through, and I'll link some information in the description section that might help you in making that decision with some things to consider. For now, we're just going to act as though we're going to serve everything in what's called a dyno in Heroku. In other apps, like in other services like Docker, you might think of it as a container. It's something that's going to house and wrap everything so that we can run it on the web. What I'll do after I've created a Heroku account, as I encourage you to do, and I go to my dashboard, I'll say new, and I'll say create new app. And let's call this app character, or let's call it a MEVN-character-generator. And that name is available. I'll choose the region to be United States. And I'll create this app. And you have a couple of options about how to deploy this app. You could connect to GitHub and do it that way. What is probably the best thing to do, and what we're going to be using in this video, is using the Heroku CLI. If I open this page and look at the Heroku CLI, you'll see that there is some installation that is installed. So I'd encourage you to do that. Now is a great time to do that, and it's fairly simple to use. It just shows you how to install Heroku on your machine, and you'll have to do some authentication to make sure that what's on your machine and you're using in your command line interface is connected to your account on Heroku remotely. And so once we do that, we'll do just as it says here in the instructions. We'll navigate to our, well, let's close some of these command line interfaces because we don't need them just yet. Or we can just minimize them. Okay, done and done. And where are we in our code? Okay, let's just use one of these CLIs, and at the root level, we're going to say, what did we say here? It wants you to navigate into your project and type in git init. I think this is already set up to GitHub, so I don't really have to. Oh no, I'm wrong. Let's say git init. We've initialized an empty repository here in this directory. And I should say, if you don't have a GitHub account or haven't initialized your Git repository, now's the time to do so. And we'll say Heroku git remote -a mevn character generator, or whatever the name of your app is. And what we've done is we've, as it says, set the git remote Heroku to this new app that we've created on Heroku. And what you might also need to do to configure your app is, if you have a database like we have here, is set up the add-on here in your, I think it's in your overview section of the resources. Yeah, in the resources section of your application. For example, we use a local Mongo database, which we won't be able to use once it's deployed to the web. So I can say find more add-ons and just search for what I need is Mongo. And I have several selections here. What I have been using for my apps on Heroku is mlab. So I can just install it. And I'll use the free version of it. And I'll find my mevn character generator and provision the add-on. So now my mevn character generator can use the mlab MongoDB cloud database for free. I can go ahead and click on that to gain more information. And what's helpful, what we're going to need to look at here is how to configure our application to use this database rather than the one that's already running on my machine. Let's take a look at that now. We can close our client. And we see that we see to connect using a driver via the standard Mongo database URI, we're going to have to use this path here. And if you've watched the previous video on actually creating this app, even if you haven't, we can still look at it. If I go into my server directory and I go to the .env file, that's where I contain the environment variables that I might use in the development of my application. And the database URL that we've been using is just our localhost characters database. So we need to replace this with the path that was provided for us by MLab. And so it says here to connect using a driver via the standard MongoDB URI. We just need to copy this and paste it here. And obviously we need to change a few of these things because this DB user and DB password is just a template. We need to actually provide our username and password. And what's not great about this process is that it's not clear, like, which password are we talking about when I use my database password? Is it like my Heroku password, or where do I find it in the MLab settings? So just an easy way of working this out is going into your when you're looking at this screen that says that you need a database user and database password, you can just say, you can go to users and add a database user, and let's call this person MEVN character user, and give them the password M3VN-character T3R-use3R, basically replacing the E's with 3's. And this is not how I write my password, so don't think that you're able to pull a fast one on me. M3VN-character T3R-US3R, basically whatever you want your database password to be. And we see that we've created a new user here called MEVN character user. We can click on that and just give us a little bit of a kind of like a JSON dialog box of what we've done, and we can use that in our URL here. So the database user will be MEVN-character-user, and the password will be M3VN-character with a 3, user with a 3. I feel weird about showing you this, even though this is just a dummy app that we're not going to use for anything, but I don't like, what is it? Heroku will never ask you for your password or personal information. Okay, so now that we've connected that, we can, instead of connecting to our local database, we should be able to connect to our the other database. Let's actually spin up our server and see what happens. So in our, what are we using this for? In our server folder, let's say npm run start. And it has connected to our database, which is now our remote database and not our local database. So we can close the terminal that we were using to run our local database. And if we navigate, we have to, looks our client isn't running, so we need to run our client, npm run serve. And if we, after the client starts running, we can navigate to the local host, and we see that there's nothing here in the character viewer, which there was before because we were accessing our local database. We can create a character. Let's give this character's name, be one of my characters, Gloric. And let's say Gloric is a mage. Create character. Go to view all characters, and we see that the get request is now has now been performed correctly, and it is getting information from our cloud database, this MLab database, rather than our local one. So that's a good way of testing to make sure that your database is up and running before you even deploy your app. If I click on this this area that's called collections in my MLab, and I have to reload the page, I see now that there is a characters collection that has been created for me based on my the way that my app works in terms of the database functionality. So that, like, the bottom layer of the stack is working, and that's great. I can actually close this database. I don't need to look at it anymore. Okay, great. So I can actually don't need to have this tab open anymore. I can close this too, just clean things up for us. Don't need any information from the CLI. And so the database is working great. Now I need to configure the rest of my app so that it's working the way that it should. In my server section, I need to configure some of these the way that the server works so that it actually works differently for my live application. To do that, actually, I'm going to need to stop the server, because the way that we built this architecture is we've segmented things pretty neatly from the client and the server directories and separated them in this way. When we're working with Heroku, we pretty much want to have all of the server level code at the root level of the application rather than in a server folder as we have it here. So I'm going to move all of this to the root directory and just delete the server directory. Which is being used by my command line interface. Great, let me just delete that. Okay, so now all the server stuff, the backend stuff, is at the root directory. We'll see why that is in just a second. In my server file, I need to do a few things to prep my application for deployment. The first thing is I have to consider that right now all of the paths that I'm using are static paths that live on my hard drive of my local machine. I need to configure them for deployment so that rather than the server or the client looking for files that are on a local machine, they're located elsewhere in the cloud. And the way we can think of that is conceptualized in what's called a process. It might be a good time actually to pause the video and just look up what the process is if you're using environmental variables as we have in a previous video, or just in general. But the essence of it is that we want to be able to access the path and the ports that are happening in whatever process has been created by our runtime for our application, rather than something that exists solely on my machine. And one way that we can handle this is right here at the bottom of our code. We've asked the server to listen at port 3000 and then log to the console that the server is started. Another way we can do this is to say, create a variable, a constant port equals process.env or environment dot uppercase port, and then 2 vertical lines 3000. And then we will just say we want the server to listen at the port. So now this is going to listen to the port 3000 in whatever process is running, not necessarily the local host. Another thing that we can do and that we should do is prep our server to serve our the static files of our client if we're going to be running the client and the server together in one container or one dyno on Heroku. Like I said, you could do this differently and have the server and the client files be hosted separately. In this application, what we're going to do, we're going to build our client for production and serve them as static files from our server. And what we'll do here is we'll say at the bottom of these imports, we'll say constant path equals require path, which allows us to do different things with the path of our files in our file system, and constant serve static equals require serve dash static. That allows us to serve static files from our server. And then the next block of code is everything that we need to use to get our database running using MongoDB, and Mongoose is our ODM for that. And then under our server use, where we're using JSON and we're also using core so that we can run our client and server in tandem and make API calls between them. We'll say server.env dot use, and in parentheses serve static, and then another parentheses underscore underscore directory name, and we can see in the tooltip, create a new middleware function to serve files from within a given root directory. The file to serve will be determined by combining req.url with the provided root directory. Essentially, we want to serve static files from whatever our root directory is, plus /roots. Actually, we're not even using roots. We can just use, we can use /client /dist. When we built this app, we didn't use the convention where you put all of your roots for your backend and models in separate folders. We just have such a simple app, we keep them all in the same folders. But what we will have is a client folder, and we'll build those files in the client for production in a distribution folder or distributable folder, which will just be called dist. So we're saying we want the server to serve static files, and the static files are located at whatever directory is the root directory in this process, plus the path of client/dist. And that's the same, and that's what we use these constants path and serve static for. That's pretty much all that we need to do for our server. What we also need to do in our root for characters, we have our character model, which Mongoose uses as a schema to map onto our database. And we have this characters root that we use for express to determine what happens when we get a GET request or a POST request at the endpoints that we've provided to access the database when people are creating characters. So right now we see that where the constant character is a model, the model that we just looked at, and we're requiring the character file, and we might run into some issues with this pathing, particularly if you have things separated into different folders. This one is pretty simple, but if you have multiple folders and you're attempting to do something like we've done here, like let's say you have this character in a model folder. That's not how you spell model. When you run the application locally, it might work just fine because Express knows where to find these files on your computer. But when you run them in the cloud or in a remote location, such as in a container or a dyno, your application might not know where to find these files. And that's why we're going to say at the top, just above the router here, we'll say constant path equals require path, as we did in the other file, and then constant character equals require path.join, and then underscore underscore dir name, comma, and then you could write here whatever your path is. So if this character file were located in another folder, you could just write that folder here. Like, let's say if characters was located in one folder and the other and character, the model, was located in another folder, you could say ... to get into another folder to the root directory, and then model/character. That's how you would write that. We don't need that here. But the path join allows you to join the directory name, the root directory, plus whatever path that you want. Might find some issues with this and we might have to revisit this, but for now that's how you do it if you have them located in separate directories. Okay, Cool. So that's all we really need to do for the back end of our application. The other thing we need to look at is in the source directory of our client, is wherever we make API request calls from our client to the server, we need to make sure that we have changed the URL endpoints so that we're actually requesting those calls from the live app and not from some local host. Because obviously we won't just be having this server running on our local machine for people to make API requests. Otherwise, why are we deploying it to the web in the first place? So I need to scrub my my client and make sure that every location where I've made a GET request such as this, it no longer says localhost 3000 / to get to that endpoint. I'm going to make sure that it now is pointing to what will be the live app. And what this is going to look like is it's going to look like HTTPS. And if you have have already reserved a URL, this might be different for you. But the default will be, what do we call this app? MEVN character generator. It will be MEVN character generator .heroku app.com, and then whatever your endpoint is. In fact, I just have one endpoint here, which is the characters endpoint. And so usually it'll be the name of your app .herokuapp.com, and then your endpoint. I'll save this. I'll go into my other file, the character viewer file. That doesn't have an API request in it. I'll go into my character creator, and that does. That's my post request. And I'll switch this one out. Okay, and now we're pretty much ready to deploy the app. The last thing that we need to do is to build these client files for production. And so I'll go into my command line terminal within the client, and the way that Vue does this for you, you can say npm run build, and it will optimize these files for production and give me a nice, neat, and clean build in my distribution directory. And I'm not sure why it's not showing here, but if I just type in ls or directory, I see that in the client directory there is a folder called dist, which it may just be hidden from view in the in Visual Studio. If I navigate to the distribution directory and take a look in it, all it has is an index HTML file, CSS directory, and a JavaScript directory. Just built it for production, nothing really fancy. But what's important to note is that it's in the root directory /client/dist directory, and that's what we're serving as static files here in the in our server. And we misspelled use, and I'm really glad that I saw that. You've probably been yelling at the monitor trying to get me to do it correctly. Okay, so that's pretty much ready for production. So what we do here is we navigate to back to our MEVN character generator screen in Heroku, and we see after we've initialized the repository here, we can deploy our application by, similar to committing it to Git. We can just deploy it by saying, we'll navigate to my root directory and say git add period, or add all of the files, and then git commit initial commit, put a message to it, git push Heroku master, and that will attempt to push everything to the remote server, the remote repository, or the remote dyno. And as it's doing this, I just want to draw your attention to one thing here. The reason why we have everything at the root directory is that with a node app, such as this one, we are going to need an entry point in this server.js file. In our package.json, which is npm run start. And I can tell you right now, the main thing that I've done incorrectly here is that I don't have a script here that is a start entry point. What Heroku requires is, and we can actually see this in action, is if I go to open app and I see there's nothing here for me to get. There's no it has not worked correctly, because what Heroku requires in a dyno is for you to have an entry point at the root level of your application that is npm run start. It essentially runs Node in a remote runtime environment for you and just has npm run start. So what we have here in this particular package.json is our this in the script section is just npm run dev, which runs node daemon server.js, which watches our files for us. We'll reboot the server as necessary. So we're going to add one that's just called start. And we'll say server.js. And so when this application starts, we're going to make sure that, when Heroku tries to run our application, when it runs npm run start, it should run node server.js rather than node daemon server.js. But there's one more little piece of configuration we might need to do if, particularly if you've been following along this tutorial with me in the previous tutorial in building this app. And you might even have to do this if you haven't used Vue and you're using something else, some other framework. It's that when we use our the Vue CLI to build our to template an app for us, a front-end app for us, it initializes a Git repository, and that can make things act a little bit wonky from the root level directory. For example, we got an indication of this when we didn't see the distribution folder in our file system here in Visual Studio. If I just click on this Show All Files button, I see that there is a folder here that's not being shown to me. And if I click on if I double click on the git ignore file, which is in the client directory, I see that for some reason Git is being told to ignore the distribution directory. Maybe that's a convention of the Vue deployment using the Vue CLI, but in any case, that's going to cause problems for me because I'm not able to push that folder to Heroku the way that I would want to. And in fact, I don't need a Git repository in my client directory, so I can open up the file browser or just delete it from the command line interface, whatever you're more comfortable with. I'm going to navigate to my client directory and just delete the Git folder and also the git ignore file. And then everything should work as intended from this point on. So, and I can hide the files that I don't need now. Okay, so now I can look at my instructions to deploy my changes, and all I have to do is type in my root directory git add dot, and then git commit am deploying, and git push Heroku master, and then that should push all of my files to the production server, to the dyno or the container that is containing all of my code. And what is going to happen is the dyno is going to install all of the dependencies that will need to run the application remotely, and use our server.js as the entry point, given our package.json's start script, which is node server.js. Now we see this message that mvn-character-generator.herokuapp.com has been deployed to Heroku. So we can navigate to that page, or we can just go to our dashboard and click on Open App. And there's some sort of error. Let's see what that is. Well, such is the life of someone trying to push a new project from a development environment to a production environment. And I've encountered issues like this, like many issues like this that you might encounter specific to your project. And one simple solution is just to look at the nature of the error where we're not able to make a GET request. And that tells me that there's some issue with where we, in our server, we are attempting to serve static files at the root directory plus this client/distribution directory. And I've encountered several issues like this in terms of just the configuration of moving from a series of files that work just fine on your desktop, but then just won't work when you push them to production. For example, in one version of a client that I pushed to production, for some reason it was working fine on my local machine, but when I pushed it to a remote machine, it was not installing MIME correctly or something, and I had to save MIME as a dependency, and it was very challenging to figure out why that was or why it wasn't working properly. And this is another issue that you might come across. For example, we are serving the distribution files in the client folder, and if we just instead move this folder to the root directory and request that the static files come from that directory and not from within the client. Now we'll go into our command line interface, add everything again. We can run a commit that we're deploying the app, and then we'll push to the master, Heroku master, and this is the same workflow that you'll use if you make some changes to your files, or let's say you rebuilt your client or whatever you want to do. And then once that's done, we can move back into our dashboard and open our app in a new tab, and we see our character generator is working just fine. It was just that we needed to move the distributable folder or distribution folder to the root directory and access it from there. I've tried this several different ways, and for some reason this is the way that wants to work right now, although it seems to be working fine within the client directory in another one of my my apps that are on Heroku. So all of that to say that there might be some additional configuration even with all of the stuff that we've done here with all of our files, like your path in your characters.js file, or if you have this located elsewhere, if you have a different route, you might need to massage the path a little bit for it to work for you, particularly if you have things located in different folders. And the internet and Google are your friends in finding solutions to this. I think one thing that you can take away from this video is that there's not a one-size-fits-all solution to deploying to Heroku, or even if you manage to make it work in deploying it to Heroku, if you try and deploy your application to Azure or to Amazon AWS or to Docker or somewhere else, you might find that you need to do additional configuration, and it might make you tear your hair out in doing so. But the good news is that once you have developed a workflow and established a workflow for yourself, it's relatively easy to tinker with that workflow and make sure that everything's working correctly. And when you change something, you'll hopefully know what it is that you changed that made the deployment process break. But as you can see, we've moved our app that was in development into a production-ready app where we can view all characters by clicking this tab. We can create a character by entering a new name. We can say Vashka is a warrior. Say create character. That sends an API request to our remote server, which now lives in the dyno on our Heroku app and has access to our remote Mongo database. And when we hit view all characters, it makes a GET request to that database through the API. We see that Vashka is indeed a warrior. And we were able to have like an intermediate stage where we had the app still running on our desktop, but we were making through the API request to our local server, we were accessing the remote database on MLab to let us know that at least MLab was working, and then we had to do our additional configuration to deploy to Heroku. So that pretty much sums up our deployment process from development to production on Heroku with an MEVN full stack app. I hope this video has been helpful for you. If it has, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and like this video. And I'd love for your help in sharing information with others about my books and games. You can find them at entromancy.com or nightpathpub.com/entromancy, and we'll see you soon.